So let me welcome you all. Dorotea Lopez is the director of the Institute of International Relations of the University of Chile. Unfortunately, she is wrapped up and she's wrapping up another event she's involved in, and she will join us shortly. But I would like to, on behalf of the Institute and of the Grupo Punta del Este, welcome you all to this occasion, to this event, which is really, for us, it's an honor and it's a privilege to be able to organize this on the occasion of Alan Wolff's book, Revitalizing the Multilateral Trading System. For those of you who need interpretation, at the bottom, there is a little globe saying interpretation. You have to choose the language you prefer. Alan Wolff is a friend, a colleague. We have worked together a number of things, and particularly in the last months, we've worked together in the Friends of Multilateralism group. He's a distinguished visiting fellow of the Peterson Institute of International Economics in Washington. He was Deputy Director General of the WTO. And as a matter of fact, when the position of Director General was vacant, he became the acting Director General for all practical purpose. He was joined by the other Director Generals, but I can safely say that he was the leader of the Deputy Director Generals in heading the organization. He has his law degree from Columbia University, and he previously has a bachelor's from Harvard College. He has had a wonderful and very varied career. He's worked in the U.S. Treasury, for example, as director of the Office of Multilateral Trade Negotiation. He was Deputy United States Trade Representative under the President Carter's administration. He was General Counsel of the USTR and the Ford administration. He was involved and the leader of the United States in the Tokyo Round negotiation. He has been advisor, negotiator for several administrations, Democrats and Republicans. And he's also been the chairman of the National Foreign Trade Council, amongst other things. And he's written this wonderful book. And I will give him the floor shortly for 30 minutes, and that's to be followed by comments from Paulina Nasal and Patrick Lowe, whom I'll introduce and their turn comes up. I'd just like to say that Alan's book is really fantastic, marvelous, very well written, entertaining, it's instructive. It tells us about the history. It tells us about the trade and the values and the benefits and the politics and the problems with trade. It's a guide, a GPS, I would call it, to the multilateral trading system. He tells us what has worked and what hasn't. Of course, the title is an indicator. He addresses the crisis the multilateral trading system has been undergoing, and he tells us what needs to be reformed, and he has several ideas for the reform. So we have the privilege now to have him with us and to present the book. But before doing so, we have Dorotea Lopez, the director of the Institute, and I would like to give her the floor for some welcome remarks. Dorotea, tiene la palabra.
Muchas gracias, Alejandro. Thank you very much. I would like to welcome all of you, to thank Alejandro for organizing this activity, and especially to Alan Wolff, that I have to confess that I've been her fan since a long time when I started to work on WTO issues. So it's a pleasure to have him presenting his book and to have Paulina and Patrick, who was kind of a boss for me working for the WTO, and Alejandro, who was my boss. So thanks to all to be here, and I'm really happy to have the opportunity to have this activity at the University of Chile.
Gracias,
Ahora
Dorothy.
escuchemos lo importante.
Okay. Alan, please. Over to you.
Thank you very much. It's good to be among friends, new friends, as well as friends of long standing. And I very much appreciate the Institute for International Studies of the University of Chile and the Grupo Punta del Este sponsoring this. And for those from the Friends of Multilateralism group who are joining us this morning on the web. When I left the WTO on March 31st, 2021, I was intent upon writing a guidebook to the institution. What I had in mind was the kind of book that I would have benefited from when I arrived at the WTO in the summer of 2017. It was not that I was unfamiliar with the rules of the international trading system. I've spent close to half a century, had by then, in the field of international trade law and negotiations. And despite all that experience, I knew I was not familiar with all aspects of the WTO or the operations of the organization. It's also the case for most representatives who are appointed to come to the WTO. There's no way that you could have a good feeling for the various aspects of the organization unless you were there and present in each individual activity. And I also wanted the trade officials back home to have an opportunity to get an up-close look at what the WTO was, and for that matter, members of the public, but mostly, I've come to think it was university students, those who will fill these jobs at the WTO, fill the jobs within delegations, within missions to the WTO, coming along to get a sense of what was created that is very special about this organization and the world trading system. My idea was that if more people, more students, more officials understood what the WTO stood for, how it worked, where it did not work, and knew more about where the rule book had gaps, there would be a sound foundation for making improvements in the institution and therefore improve the functioning of the world trading system. So my book is about the system that enlightened foreign economic policies were created just after the end of the Second World War, and the need for that system to be made equal to current challenges facing the world today, whether due to climate change, future pandemics, the impact of continuing technological advances, including artificial intelligence. The challenges are great, they're many, and is the institution up to meeting them as it's currently constituted? The World Trading System stands for the proposition that international cooperation based upon the rule of law and on sound economic principles is essential to the future well-being and prosperity of the peoples in all of the 164 member countries and in the 23 countries seeking admission to the institution. The member countries, including those in Latin America, are linked to other nations by this common interest. So what's in the book? The book begins with a chapter on the origins of trade. Trade predated our species, predated Homo sapiens, which I found interesting to discover. It was first noted by archaeologists in the fact that obsidian, which was used for making weapons, it's sort of the rare earths of the day, was not present everywhere on the planet. And in fact, you had to either trade the obsidian itself or tools from one place to another in order to have weapons. So our predecessors as a species had trade, and evidence of trade in the archaeological record exists before there was writing. And even writing by some scholars, many scholars actually, is seen as perhaps an offshoot of trade, that one had to take some clay tablets and send them off with the goods that were going to travel great distances to give instructions as to what the disposition of the goods should be. And Arab traders, whom we think of as mainly confined to the desert, actually were great seamen and traveled with the monsoon winds and from one part of the ocean to the other, as the Chinese and those along the Silk Road moved along the along where the Great Wall is today. So the record is strong for the existence of trade. Now, I looked for today into what could be said about Latin America, which is not in the book. And archaeological expeditions and investigations have found that it is likely that trade was quite extensive in Latin America. There are the Inca, which you would know, and I didn't. The Inca Empire has 25,000 miles, 40,000 kilometers of roads, and it is theorized that these roads covered trade, facilitated trade, as well as other forms of communication. Cortez wrote a second letter to his sponsor, Charles V, in 1520, and he described a market as follows. Here in this city, which I'll probably not pronounce correctly, Tlaxcala, a market is held every day, and upward of 30,000 people come to buy and sell, without counting the other trade which goes on elsewhere in the city. In this market, there's everything one might need or wish to trade for provisions, as well as clothing and footwear. Here is jewelry of gold and silver and precious stones and other ornaments of featherwork, and all is well laid out as in any square or any marketplace in the world. So, so this pre-Columbian era in Latin America certainly had trade. And there's a lesson from actually what Cortez was writing, as well as from the historical record, that trade takes place for a variety of reasons, and it always has. And for those of you who have sort of a dim view of how we're conducting ourselves today in international cooperation, it's likely trade will always be there. It's basic to civilization. The book next looks at the WTO's own prehistory, the GATT era, the founding of the multilateral trading system, actually pre-GATT, based on a vision of Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill, who met at Placentia Bay in the summer of 1941 to talk about post-war aims. And it's sort of interesting in a variety of ways. One is that the United States was not in World War II at that time. So talking about post-war aims for a war that the United States wasn't in was sort of an interesting thing for Roosevelt to be doing. But he had been in the Wilson administration, Woodrow Wilson administration, and John Maynard Keynes had been in the delegation of Great Britain at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919. And they had some background in what the role of trade should be in the world going forward. And what they said was, and it was a press release, later called the Atlantic Charter, and 15 other countries joined it, but it was just a press release from two world leaders who said one of the items on trade was equal access to markets, equal access to supplies. It's rather straightforward, rather simple, and it is largely the basis for the world trading system that was created after World War II. I appear in the book from time to time in cameo appearances, in footnotes largely. I first went to the WTO in 1970 to defend a U.S. Rebate of direct taxes, which the problem was I stood in a room of 100 delegations to explain why this was WTO, or GATT, I should say, consistent. The problem with my argument was it wasn't, and I convinced no one. and it was later condemned, of course. The next time I was there was to defend a U.S. import surcharge, which was 10% surcharge across the board on all goods. And our defense, I'm proud to say, was not that it was WTO or GATT, I should say GATT consistent. It was that we could have done worse, and it was necessary. It was for international monetary purposes. The US dollar had been tied to gold, needed to devalue and delink from gold, and this was a way out. And so we see today sort of a repeat of threats of this sort of thing, but for quite different purposes. I was on site for the attempted wrap-up of the Uruguay round. It was in 1990 in Brussels, the Heysel Convention Center, and it didn't wrap up like these things. So the one advice I've given to the folks in Abu Dhabi on their upcoming meeting of the ministerial in February is, don't let the hall get taken by somebody else, the conference center get taken by anybody else shortly after you think this is going to wrap up, because most negotiations just take longer than you think they will take. Well, I was with the USTR at the time, Mickey Cantor, on at about 1 a.m. on the last day of the Uruguay round. And so I have a sense of what people were thinking, what delegations were thinking. I was in touch with the Japanese and the Europeans and the UK in that day. And I've now compared my recollections with others as to what was in the minds of those who were present about the WTO's finding. It was primarily about binding dispute settlement. The US thought that it would regulate, somehow constrain the common agricultural policy of the EEC, and the rest of the world thought it could constrain the United States resort to unilateralism. But little else, very little else was considered at that moment. It was felt that there had to be something different than the GATT, because the GATT was about trade in goods, and along had come the intellectual property agreement and services and other things that didn't fit neatly into that construct. The next part of the book covers the history of the progress of the WTO through 12 ministerial conferences. Many were dubbed in reports at the time, contemporaneous reports, as failures. When I was locked down in a very empty WTO building during COVID, the 25th anniversary of the WTO posters and pictures were up around the atrium. And what struck me is, you look at those pictures, like the one opposite my office, which was of the Seattle Ministerial, and they were recorded at the time as complete disasters. I was present inside the WTO at the 11th Ministerial in Buenos Aires in December of 2017, and it too was labeled as a failure, which I think was entirely wrong. I thought it was grand. Why? Because the joint statement initiatives were begun. That was one reason. Countries that wanted to negotiate something, wanted to make some progress, decided that they would do it, and they moved forward. The rest of the world covers the WTO mainly through disputes. But most of the WTO activities are not in litigation, in fact, and not in ministerial conferences. They're in endless committee meetings. If you walk into the WTO, you see a list of them every day, quite extensive. And one thing I did, which I don't think has been done previously, is place the reader in various settings, various meetings, a meeting on standards, which sounds very dry and can be, but was actually quite interesting. About one of the things I captured was the Chinese representative saying to the European, your standard on automatic driving, which has the system kick in when someone appears to be falling asleep, isn't really constructed correctly. And it's quite detailed explanation as to why it should be somewhat different standard. I also put the reader in the probably the landmark occasion of the entire WTO era, which was the Working Party on bringing China into the WTO, something very contentious in the United States today. But it certainly stands out as one of the most important things that happened in the WTO era. Lastly, I address where reforms were needed in the international institutional framework of the WTO and provide some possibilities of solutions, ways forward, which everyone is free to disagree with. And actually, anyone who knows much about the WTO does disagree with, because everyone has their own solutions for problems. But that's okay, as long as there's an attempt to be made to solve these problems. So what are my conclusions from my 50 years of life devoted to the participating as a practitioner largely in the world trading system and with the WTO? One thing I found absolutely stunning was the fact that some 17 heads of state came together in 1998 to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the GATT and to wish well the new foundling organization, the WTO. They included Nelson Mandela, Bill Clinton, Tony Blair, Jacques Santé for the EU, each making eloquent statements about what had been achieved and their hopes for the future. And Nelson Mandela said, "It wasn't my government that signed us up, South African government. It was an apartheid government, white government. It wasn't my government that signed us up to the WTO, but we're going to make a go of it, and we're going to work at it." It's really a very hopeful set of remarks. So now we're in the year of the 75th Diamond Jubilee, and there are no heads of state headed for Geneva to celebrate. In fact, quite the opposite. Many heads of state have very little use for the constraints that are offered by the international trading system. When members talk about WTO reform, mostly what they're talking about is getting back the appellate body. And Ngozi said this a week ago when she came to Washington to have a discussion on the record with Catherine Tai, that most countries say, well, the dispute settlement system is broken and we have to fix it. And the way we fix it is we put back the appellate body, which was terminated by the United States. And the cover of my book is a picture taken on the last day of binding dispute settlement of the WTO. That's why I chose it. It has sort of a wintry sun with a dark image of a wall of the WTO. And it marks a dramatic change in how the trading system is operated. When I say binding dispute settlement, for those who are not expert in the area, it only means a final decision. Can there be a final decision? And 30 countries have now appealed to a body that doesn't exist, the appellate body, and they're warehousing these cases. They're preventing them from becoming final, presumably with a desire to continue doing whatever they were doing that actually a panel has already found violated their international obligations. So they considered binding dispute settlement as the jewel in the crown, litigation being the jewel in the crown. I always thought it wasn't the jewel that was so very important, and also the jewel had some flaws, but it's the crown. It's a system of rules. It's the system of procedures of countries working together in international cooperation to make sure that trade has an opportunity to flow across borders. So what are the hurdles to moving forward? On the part of the US and some other members, the appellate body overreached. It narrowed trade remedies. If you were a trade negotiator, you probably would be surprised that the appellate body found that you really couldn't use a safeguard at all, even though the Uruguay round had a safeguards agreement, unless you could tie it to trade due to increased imports from a tariff concession. It made perfect logic if you had your head largely buried in the Vienna Convention on the Interpretation of Treaties. If you had any sense whatsoever politically, you would say the system has to have governors. It has to have a way to let off pressure. And the Safeguards Agreement was one way to let off pressure to take care of those who were harmed by trade temporarily. So there was time for adjustment. Similarly, there were a narrowing of the use of anti-dumping, which those who won those cases applauded. Lighthizer came to, the U.S. Trade Representative, came to Buenos Aires, and he used his 3 minutes to actually say some substantive things. One, he said, is you should not gain through litigation what you could not get through negotiation. Well, the appellate body is not coming back with the U.S. attached to it in any event. So what sort of system could emerge? It has become current now that the U.S. is dug in on you cannot review national security measures. That if the U.S. wants to invoke national security on anything it cares to do, it can. You can't second guess that. So what's the way through that? In my view, you could have the country invoking the national security to put on import restrictions, pay a price, pay compensation, negotiate a different deal for those who are adversely affected, or suffer retaliation. It doesn't work for everything, but it works for some things. And the last hurdle is one would note that the U.S. and China are really at each other's throats, not literally, but figuratively anyway. Certainly have differences that are vast. I do not think it's politically possible for the U.S. Negotiator to come home and say to the U.S. Congress, I just agreed to binding dispute settlement with China. And they say, well, did you cure all the problems we saw in that trade? And they say, no, I didn't. I just agreed to this. Not going to happen. And I've said in other fora, there is no J Street in Washington. There's an alphabetic series of streets, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, K, L. No J, because John Jay negotiated the Treaty of Paris, ending the U.S. Revolutionary War, and it was not popular. So he was burned in effigy when he came home, fortunately not burned in person, but no Street J. We're not going to have binding dispute settlement between the U.S. and China, other than if the U.S. and China sit down and say, this is how we'll handle our differences, then you could do it. But imposed on them or imposed on the United States, not going to happen. So there's a geopolitical element to this. And that's not as drawn out as much in the book as I would have, but reflecting on it later. A start in the right direction, in my view, is for the members to instruct Ngozi. I tried to do this when I was 1/4 acting Director General. Don't accept any more appeals into the void, because there is no appellate body, unless we, the members, instruct you that you can. In the state of California, if you're missing for 5 years, you can be declared dead. The appellate body will have been missing for 5 years in 2024, and the members have said, we'll fix it. And if they don't fix it, I would say, Ngozi, you can't accept appeals into the void. What would that cause? If you have a panel, you have to agree what you're going to do with the decision between two members who are litigating. Is it going to be final? Is it going to be appealed in an MPIA, a multi-party interim arrangement? Is it going to be appealed in a separate deal as to some kind of appellate function? The fraud has to be ended in order to break through this. I'm a great believer that obligations have to be lived up to or a price paid for departing from them. Equally important, maybe more important, but equally important certainly, is that like-minded countries have to have a place to come together and make agreements without being blocked, without being told, no, you can't do it here. No trade and services agreement, you go across the street because it can't be done at the WTO. Of course it can be done at the WTO. And I'm in the just do it school. I know there are legal experts who will say, well, you need to amend the WTO, or you need to get a vote or something of the sort. I'd say the way Azevedo did, the one very brave thing he did was say, over opposition, I'm going to back these joint statement initiatives. Some people want to get together in a room and discuss how they'll deal with a particular issue. The like-minded can get together and they can agree on what they want to do. The next step is, and Ngozi hasn't quite put it this way, but she did take a position when she was here in Washington a week ago. Like-minded have to be able to reach agreements consistent with the objectives of the WTO in the WTO and can't be blocked by non-participants. So that's the second area of reform. The third area of reform is to acknowledge the important role of the Director General and Secretariat in shaping the agenda and driving progress. And I'm sure, since I know that there'll be some commentary that says, that didn't work in the past. It did work with Arthur Dunkel putting a compromise draft on the table in the Uruguay round. We wouldn't have a WTO if there weren't a GATT Director General who said, I think I know where you're all going to come out, and I'm just putting the draft on the table, and you can agree or disagree as you see fit. And they did agree. So I compare in this book the role of the president of the World Bank, the managing director of the International Monetary Fund, the Secretary General of the OECD, and you find that they're very different. And you could say, well, trade's different, it's very politically sensitive. Yeah, but actually, I know of no organization of humans on this planet, including private clubs, where you don't have some form of executive to help run the show. What will the future hold? At this moment, the most likely Republican US presidential candidate has pledged to put an across-the-board tariff on all imports, basically a declaration of a trade war, tantamount to US renunciation of its international obligations. The general election will take place in the presidential election in November 2024, as well as the congressional election, and it'll determine, among other things, as to whether the US will turn its back on the global trading system, whether as a nation we will keep our word. John McCain quipped. He was a candidate for president in 2008. He quipped, it's always darkest before it turns pitch black. It's all too easy to feel that, the future is very grim. I don't think we get to the worst case scenario. I certainly hope not. In the movie Oppenheimer, which I recommend to folks, the scientist asked by the head of an army major who's head of the Manhattan Project to create an atom bomb, whether there'll be an uncontrollable reaction, nuclear reaction that's in the atmosphere that destroys the world. And Oppenheimer says, well, I've talked to my physicists, and they say the chances are near zero. And his reply is, this Leslie Grove replies, I'd prefer the answer zero. We cannot tolerate actually the US turning its back on the international trading system. I hope we don't, although there'd be many things at issue in this next election. In the year 2020, I was asked by the government of Saudi Arabia, they had the presidency of the G20 that year, what are the principles underlying the WTO? And when I started working with principles, I actually came up with values. And they said, well, that's not a principle, that's really a value. And I came up with a list of values of of the WTO. The obvious ones, non-discrimination, transparency, national treatment, but much more than that. One value understated, which was an original value, was peace. The WTO is a peace project, just like the European Union, the European Coal and Steel Community before it were peace projects. The WTO is designed to support peace. And you could say it worked. It's been 78 years, and there's been, so far, no major conflict between, no shooting war between the major powers. We have to hang on to that. But the relevance to the WTO today is not to settle geopolitics, although if anybody has an idea on how to do that, that'd be most welcome. But it is to raise the standard of living in conflict-affected countries so they have a chance at stability and a chance at peace. That's in the opening words of the ITO, the International Trade Organization Charter, which is really a founding document, even though the ITO didn't come into effect. Trade doesn't guarantee peace, but for Somalia, Sudan, South Sudan, Ethiopia, a number of the conflict-affected countries, Timor-Leste, which will probably come into the WTO in February, you listen to their leaders, and what they say is, if we could integrate into the world economy, if we could trade, if we could raise the standard of living of our peoples, we will have a better chance at a durable peace. So the WTO is still a peace project. It's not for Russia and Ukraine yet. It is not for, at this stage, China and the United States. It is for these conflict-affected countries. So where do I come out? I worry about the liberal international order. I worry about it fraying. And my advice to the vice ministers meeting to prepare for Abu Dhabi later this month is that preserve what you have. This comes also from talking to quite a number of delegations when I was over in Geneva 2 weeks ago. Preserve what you have. So don't create new exceptions. Secondly, repair what's been lost. Try to get binding dispute settlement back. Thirdly, build on what you already have to meet new challenges such as climate change, food insecurity, future pandemics, and the inexorable disruption caused by new technologies. I mean, there's a lot of work to be done, and trade is relevant to most of these issues. MC13 should try to achieve what it can. It should result in a series of work programs to prepare for negotiations on other vitally important subjects. The level of ambition should be high, as the challenges are daunting and they're unavoidable. Have to get food from one place to another in the time of climate change, but you also have to avoid price spikes that cause major problems. This is a test of international cooperation. And all WTO ambassadors received a copy of this book. My hope is that all listening today, if they teach or know someone who does teach, that they utilize the book in university courses to spread the understanding of what the world trading system is, to value it, to preserve it, and to improve it. So thank you very much. I look forward to the comments and our discussion and any questions.
Thank you very much, Alan, for those remarks. For those who haven't, I really recommend that you get the book and read it. It's a pleasure to read it. So well written. And incidentally, I just put on the chat, a flyer from Cambridge Press University about the book and special prices that you can take advantage of right now. So next we have comments by Patrick Lowe. Patrick is a very dear friend from way back when. He's a Kenyan national, also holds a Spanish citizenship. He speaks rather good Spanish, I should say. He is presently in Kenya for a few weeks. He has a PhD from Sussex University. He joined the GATT Secretariat in 1980, and he worked until 1988, and then he moved to Mexico with his wife because she had responsibilities in the High Commission of Refugees then. And he was a consultant, freelanced, and he taught at the Colegio de Mexico, amongst many other things. He was a consultant for the Sistema Económico Latinoamericano, where I worked. That was a lot of fun to work with Patrick. He then joined the World Bank for 4 years, early 90s. And then he returned to the WTO in 1994. And he held several responsibilities, amongst them, for example, he was Chief of Staff for Director General Mike Moore. And then he also was the Chief Economist. He was the Director of the Economic Research and Statistic Division from 97 until 2013, when he retired. He's been professor at Hong Kong University, at the Graduate Institute, Kent State University. He has been vice president of research of the Fung group, and so on and so forth. And he is a prolific writer and one of the top trade economists in the world. So he knows the system inside out. And so we now stand to benefit from his comment to see how he looks, not only the book, but how he looks at this process of reform of the WTO from his perspective, and taking into account Alan's ideas and approaches to this, to the reform. Patrick?
Well, thank you for that, Alejandro. I think you were trying to set me up. Greetings, everyone. I recognize some of you I know, some of you I don't. I shall be brief. You know, when you say you're going to be brief, what the real outcome is. I think Alan truly should be congratulated, thoroughly congratulated, for this massive effort of putting together the book. He is extremely well placed to do so after 5 decades plus, I don't want to say how many plus how many, of having worked on all these issues, the private sector as a lawyer, for the US government, and ultimately for the World Trade Organization. So he brings lots of different perspectives to the issues from a basis of very long-standing experience. I think there are 3 books here, Alan. You've really written 3 books, rolled them into one, in the sense that there are 3 quite separate, I think, quite separate elements in the book. They fit together fine, but they deal with slightly different things at each time. The first, of course, is the analysis of the background, the history, the origins of the system, the political and economic forces that shape the multilateral trading system. The second, and I think this is extremely useful, is the insider's account of the working methods and procedures of the WTO, something that otherwise are a little bit confusing, perhaps, to outsiders. And so I think it was a valuable exercise in demystification. And the third is, of course, his series of proposals for reform, and almost all of which I agree with. One that I question, but we'll get there in a minute. So I think we're really in a bind. People were talking informally at the beginning of the session and saying that the WTO is still on its way down. And I guess that there's a case for saying that. What is going to create the turning point, or at least the arrest of what seems to many people to be creeping irrelevance? Of course, if the WTO is allowed to sink too far in trying to bring it back, will get harder and harder, and that is a serious proposition from a global point of view in terms of peace and continuity. Just to talk about some of the issues that I think are really difficult. Some of them are not of the WTO's own making. They're just very trade relevant, and the WTO can't function if it doesn't address them. One of them is, which we really haven't started to see the impact of, is climate change. And it's actually quite sad to see that the membership is taking the wrong direction with how to deal with carbon leakage. With this idea of a border tax adjustment is just asking for trouble. The far simpler way of doing this, and it's kind of depressing that governments aren't willing to go there, is to have a tax. You have a uniform tax, which is, it hasn't, at the end of the day, it's an agreement, but it doesn't actually have to impinge on adjustments at the border of any kind. As soon as you start adjusting at the border, you run into all sorts of problems. Whose emissions are you adjusting to? Why those emissions and why not other ones? So it's that I think is a really big question for the system, and of course that's only one element of it. All the other things are to do with sustainability, which trade comes in many different guises. Alan has mentioned quite a bit about national security. I completely agree with Alan on one thing, which is that national security provisions in the GATT and the GATT are really the only provisions where it is absolutely clear that a government decides for itself whether national security is at stake. And and it's been used with a huge amount of restraint until President Trump came along. And so it's been a safety valve, if you like, but it's been little used by countries that at different points in time could have used it. Cuba could have used it, Nicaragua could have used it, Argentina could have used it, but they refrained. Then what happened with Trump's use of this provision was that, frankly, it didn't pass the laugh test, in the sense that what he was saying national security was being threatened by were rather minor shares of imports in steel and aluminium. And so what happened after that was that everyone else became quite irresponsible too, and started reacting in ways which were inconsistent with the rules, either with voluntary export restraints or with safeguards that didn't follow due process or whatever it was. So now you have a situation in WTO where virtually every significant trading partner is in some way or another knowingly at fault in terms of its WTO obligations. We've got to pull back from that. How are we going to pull back from that? I don't know. I think it's part of a much bigger problem. On dispute settlement, I think there's been a lot said about this. I kind of agree with Alan that we shouldn't take it as given that we need an appellate body. We need something binding, but not necessarily an appellate body. I don't know. That's up for debate. And then we have these old issues which are festering away, which agriculture, which is in a sort of equilibrium, but it's a very suboptimal equilibrium as far as many countries in the world are concerned. And you have the development problem which has haunted the WTO since the beginning in many ways, has been poorly addressed and has held up progress in all sorts of different ways. And I think it could be dealt with far more easily by recognizing that it's not a regulatory issue at all. And as things stand today, they may not last this way, but as things stand today, everyone is committed to uniform regulation. Eventually, the special differential treatment there is about phasing. But in essence, everyone obeys the same rules, or it can be challenged for not doing so. So where's the special differential treatment there? It's minor. It's just a time specificity issue. The real issue is market access, and there everyone's a sinner. And so why are we talking? Why are we? If it's all the pressure on developing countries and all the protests in developing countries are about market access, we shouldn't be thinking of it as special different treatment at all. We should be thinking as the extent to which countries are willing to go to open their markets without being arm twisted. So I just have quite strong views on that, because I have, over the years, I've watched how difficult this debate has been and how much it has frustrated progress. The other big thing coming down the pike, which is going to be a real challenge, is the digital economy. is the WTO going to be able to, they're working on it, but is the WTO going to be able to have a sufficiently multilateral setup which facilitates digital exchange and ensures that the fairness and reasonable access? The way that discussion's going now, I think it's the first time, at least I can remember, where there have been explicit questions asked about whether we need to ditch MFN or redefine it. So I think this is actually a real challenge coming down the pipe for the WTO. As if it doesn't have enough challenges. I could go on, but I don't want to waste. I don't want to use too much time. I just want to say one thing. I mean, I know. Well, let me just say this about leadership and the capacity to manage geopolitics. You know, political scientists wonder whether the system can work without a hegemon. So the economists think of monopoly as being simpler than oligopoly, where, you know, imperfect competition, where you have to get some kind of cooperation and a little less of influence mongering. That obviously is a problem, but the quality of leadership really, I think, is something that needs to be worked on in different ways. But governments, that presupposes that governments actually see the value of the multilateral trading system. And as I said at the beginning, the worry is that they won't see it until it's too late. Then they'll have a hell's again trying to reconstruct something. The one area where I would take issue with, well, not really take issue with Alan, but at least not entirely agree with him, is the proposal that we should have an executive body, which would be much more secretariat-based with secretariat influence. I mean, I think it's a great idea. I think it would certainly sharpen efficiency, but I don't think it's got a chance in hell of being politically feasible. It was in the ITO as an idea, but of course we know what happened to the ITO. I think the best example we have in history of why this doesn't work is the consultative group of 18 that was set up in the 1980s. It was quite a mild effort. It was simply that there were going to be 18 countries selected in various ways who would sit and contemplate and discuss on the basis of good inputs from the various sources where the system should go. So it was a quasi-formalized thing which actually made countries engage. And it was well appreciated, but the problem was the selectivity. And what finally collapsed it was an irreconcilable difference between Brazil and Mexico as to who should have the CG18 position.
Let me turn now to Paulina Nasala, switch to Spanish. Paulina es una gran amiga. Hace muchos años he tenido el privilegio de trabajar con ella desde el año 93, donde ella se integró a la Dirección General de Relaciones Económicas Internacionales. Ella es economista en la Universidad de Chile, tiene un máster en Economía Aplicada en la Universidad de Nueva York, que ella ha sido profesora de Economía en la Universidad de Chile, en la Universidad Diego Portales, en la Academia Diplomática. Ha sido consultora del Banco Interamericano de Desarrollo, de Lehman Brothers también. Fue directora de Asuntos Económicos Multilaterales. Le correspondió ser el senior official de Chile en el APEC, también en la OCDE, en la OMC, y participó activamente liderando las negociaciones para el Tratado de Libre Comercio, las negociaciones con Turquía, con Vietnam, Hong Kong, con Tailandia, y muy importante el TPP, el Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. El año 17 ella le correspondió asumir como directora general. Hoy día es una subsecretaría de Relaciones Económicas Internacionales, y ella condujo el equipo chileno en la fase final de esas negociaciones para hacer, yo diría, el acuerdo de libre comercio más moderno y más profundo que existe en el mundo. Ahora ella reside en Washington y es directora ahí de su firma consultora ProAmérica. Y Paulina ahora le he pedido que haga comentarios, sobre todo para ver el sistema multilateral de comercio de la perspectiva de un país latinoamericano, qué es lo que representa, y en ese contexto cómo se puede apreciar las posibilidades, la necesidad y de la reforma y los enfoques que se pueden usar para ello. Paulina, te doy la palabra.
First of all, I would like to thank Alejandro, al Grupo Punta del Este, and the Instituto de Estudios Internacionales for la invitación. It is an honor to be able to chair this panel with Alan and Patrick in this difficult task of how to revitalize the World Trade system. I want to start congratulating Alan on his book. It's really an excellent contribution to the global discussion for the academic world, for the public policy makers, and for the new generations. To make my minutes more efficient, I will now switch to Spanish to highlight and comment a couple of issues that Alan addresses in his book. Primero, justamente, y me gustó mucho, Alan, que el libro se dedicara una parte importante a contextualizar, ¿no es cierto?, la historia, cómo se creó la Organización Mundial de Comercio, desde, ¿no es cierto?, el GATT y la creación de estas instituciones como el Fondo Monetario, el Banco Mundial, que obviamente que rodearon un periodo de mucha inestabilidad. El mundo fue atacado por estas dos guerras mundiales, la Gran Depresión, el extremismo político, y con todas esas negativas consecuencias, obviamente, los hacedores de política pública evidentemente buscaron buscar y potenciar esa interdependencia económica como medio, como tú lo mencionaste, para asegurar la paz y la prosperidad. Y yo creo que vemos ahora más que nunca la importancia de que esos objetivos siguen plenamente vigentes. Y finalmente también uno puede evaluar, sobre todo países como el nuestro, si la apuesta fue acertada en su minuto. Y obviamente durante gran parte de estos últimos 75 años, los países derribaron las barreras comerciales y dieron paso a una integración económica que trajo una prosperidad global y un periodo también inusualmente largo, sin guerras. A eso se le suma obviamente los impactos en el comercio, que según el último informe, el comercio, los volúmenes de comercio aumentaron 20 veces desde su creación. Y también escuchaba a la directora general Ngozi, que decía que el 75% del comercio mundial de mercancías se realiza según los términos arancelarios NMF de la OMC. Entonces, al final, si uno empieza a evaluar si eliminamos todo eso, ¿cómo quedaríamos? ¿En qué caos? Y este crecimiento para América Latina no fue la excepción. Un estudio del Banco Interamericano de Desarrollo que realizó una evaluación de los resultados de la apertura comercial e integración en América Latina, obviamente con sus luces y sombras, destacó justamente que esta liberalización y vivir en el mundo normado por reglas, trajo muchos beneficios a América Latina. Y hace una comparación cómo habría sido el PIB per cápita sin y con liberalización, y el PIB per cápita de la población en esta región habría sido entre un 30 y un 40% menos sin apertura comercial. Y uno, si compara, ¿no es cierto?, el resultado de esta política pública, yo creo que esta ha sido de las más exitosas, ¿no es cierto?, considerando todas las otras. Pero obviamente a pesar de ello, y lo que nos convoca aquí a discutir, es que el sistema y la OMC en particular están atravesando por un periodo difícil, yo diría desde su creación el más difícil de todo. Lo que nos ha tocado participar de alguna manera en todas las rondas negociadoras antiguas, todos saben que todos enfrentamos periodos difíciles, pero a su vez la crisis actual yo diría que es mucho más profunda. Balancear intereses de las partes evidentemente es complejo, pero aquí está mucho más en juego, y algo que también aborda el libro es el tema de la legitimidad y la confianza en el sistema. Y aquí ha habido varios puntos de inflexión que los menciona el libro y que a mí me gustaría destacar. Una, evidentemente, la inconclusa ronda de Doha, pues yo creo que aquí ya quedó claramente de manifiesto la capacidad o la incapacidad de la organización o de sus miembros, porque finalmente somos los miembros, de lograr acuerdos. No es menor que 164 miembros lo hacen doblemente difícil. Los últimos 10 años, estas crecientes críticas a la globalización, hay un mayor poder de la sociedad civil, esta falta de inclusión y de una distribución mucho más equitativa de los beneficios de esta apertura, crearon fuertes inequidades entre la población que también fueron mermando este descontento y esta falta, ¿no es cierto?, de legitimidad. Bueno, la pandemia, no vamos a entrar en las tristes consecuencias que tuvo la pandemia, pero principalmente para América Latina fue sumamente dolorosa, una de las regiones más afectadas, y aspectos revolucionarios transversales como el cambio climático, los avances tecnológicos, lo que no ha ido aparejado de la negociación de nuevas reglas. La geopolítica, como también nombra Alan en su libro, ha jugado un rol clave justamente en este bloqueo de seguir avanzando en la organización. Y varios de los aspectos anteriores han impactado no solo al OMC, sino al multilateralismo en general. Pero si uno tuviera que centrarse en 3 temas que se mencionan en el libro, pero que también han mencionado muchas autoridades respecto de esta, llamémosle, paralización del sistema, tienen que ver con algo que también comentó Patrick, es el primero es la soberanía nacional, tanto en lo relativo a la resolución de disputas como a la seguridad nacional. El choque entre las reglas del OMC y la soberanía nacional obviamente se hizo mucho más evidente en la presidencia de Donald Trump, pero Estados Unidos desde mucho antes, desde Bush, pasando hasta por Obama, han criticado este activismo jurisdiccional del órgano de apelación. Hace muy poco también escuchaba a la USDR Catherine Tai en un webinar donde efectivamente explicaba la posición de Estados Unidos respecto al órgano de apelación y sus aprehensiones respecto a cómo, a juicio de Estados Unidos, el órgano se ha extralimitado sistemáticamente en sus funciones. Pero la soberanía nacional también se ve afectada por las nuevas ideas sobre el libre comercio, y eso también nosotros lo vemos mucho, y como región nos impacta mucho. Países que están abogando por un comercio gestionado que debe centrarse en la seguridad nacional, priorizando primero el bienestar local. Y lo que está detrás de eso es definitivamente una falta de confianza que en el largo plazo el sistema sí puede generar beneficios para todo el mundo. Así también las cadenas de suministro, y uno ve también en los discursos de las grandes potencias que las cadenas de suministro no solamente tienen que ser resilientes después de la pandemia, sino que también tienen que venir de fuentes seguras. Y ahí han surgido todos estos conceptos que dan para otro libro, del nearshoring, del friendshoring, del powershoring, que la verdad, obviamente, lo que habla un poco es el objetivo principal y de donde nace, es el decoupling de China. La segunda crisis que me gustaría mencionar también son estas prácticas comerciales, llamémosle subversivas, de algunos miembros, pero lo que se le atribuyó principalmente a China. Y uno lee siempre que el mundo está abierto a China, pero que China no está abierto al mundo. Pero la verdad que en la actualidad vemos que cada día muchos más países están aplicando distintos temas de apoyos y subsidios industriales. Ahora es un temazo, y aunque la OMC los prohíbe, por ejemplo, somos testigos de que los países los aplican. Y acá también es una discusión, digamos, que la organización requiere urgente una nueva mirada. Los subsidios per se no son malos ni buenos. Muchos de ellos buscan objetivos muy loables, como obviamente apuntalar algún sector productivo. En el caso de Estados Unidos, por ejemplo, que está lanzando una fuerte política industrial respecto de cómo atacar el cambio climático, y a su vez pone muchos recursos, créditos, etcétera, para ayudar a su sector manufacturero a que puedan transitar de mejor manera hacia una energía limpia. Y la tercera crisis que afecta a la legitimidad de la organización también viene por su falta de impacto en estas políticas que van mucho más allá de la liberalización comercial. Y también es muy tentador y sexy, digamos, atribuirle a una institución que contribuya a otro tipo de objetivos, que contribuya, como decíamos, a la lucha contra el cambio climático, a la defensa de los derechos humanos, a los temas de género, a impulsar mucho más a los países en desarrollo para nivelar más la cancha. Y hasta el momento lo que hemos visto en general es que la OMC obviamente se ha enfocado en cómo el comercio puede contribuir a ello, pero la sociedad ahora demanda un rol mucho más activo y efectivo de la organización en estas materias. Esto obviamente hubo un paréntesis en la época de la pandemia donde la OMC sí jugó un rol activo en el tema de las vacunas, en el tema de ayudar a las poblaciones en necesidad para levantar la restricción a los alimentos, a los medicamentos, para abordar los temas de inseguridad alimentaria, pobreza y hambre. El otro tema es efectivamente la institucionalidad o la gobernanza de la OMC, el rol del secretariado, de la directora general, y no me voy a detener en eso. Alan lo aborda en el libro, hizo mención un poco acá, Patrick también menciona, pero evidentemente es un tema que hay que discutir y que tiene que formar parte del paquete de reformas de la Organización Mundial de Comercio. Y un tema para mí fundamental, y que a veces se pasa un poquito por alto, no solo en la OMC, sino que en todo este tipo de instituciones, es su conexión con la sociedad civil, con las personas. Finalmente, todos los logros y los trabajos en curso, uno siempre tiene que pensar que son para la gente, para el bienestar de nuestra población. Como se mencionó en el preámbulo de Marrakech, desde ahí ya se reconoce que el comercio debe contribuir a elevar los niveles de la población, a generar pleno empleo para nuestros trabajadores, a perseguir un desarrollo sostenible y proteger el medio ambiente. ¿Para quién? Para las personas. Entonces, si la ciudadanía no logra dimensionar este link entre el rol y los objetivos de estas instituciones vis a vis, ¿no es cierto? Todos estos objetivos de contar con un comercio normado, transparente, justo, difícilmente se van a involucrar y van a ser parte de una defensa de un sistema multilateral. Y obviamente, y lamentablemente en periodo eleccionario, estas variables cuentan sobremanera. La OCDE, por ejemplo, tiene instituciones que son asesores constantes, el comité empresarial, el comité de asociaciones de uniones laborales, tiene el foro público, tiene el OECD Watch, que todos juntos forman parte de la estructura institucional de la OMC. Y la OMC tiene su foro público, pero a mí me parece que no hay que escatimar en reforzar, ¿no es cierto?, y lograr comunicar mejor los resultados de la importancia de contar con un comercio normado y de una organización como la OMC. Mucho se ha escrito y también he leído un par de libros de trust y sus impactos, la confianza, la falta de confianza generalizada en las instituciones. En nuestro país acá lo vivimos así en carne propia. No hay confianza en las instituciones, no hay confianza en los gobiernos, no hay confianza en los políticos, incluso en las relaciones interpersonales y en las negociaciones tiene que haber confianza entre las personas para poder llegar a acuerdos concretos. Y una manera de abordarlo obviamente es comunicando, así que esa es partiendo por comunicar que obviamente la OMC va más allá de su órgano de evaluación, la organización no está muerta, y uno lo escucha a menudo decir, la organización está muerta, está ahí. Y la verdad que yo obviamente me declaro una fan del sistema, y de todos los procesos que contribuyen a tener un mundo más integrado, interconectado. Están funcionando los otros órganos, el sistema de apelación en primera instancia funciona, las negociaciones continúan, se mencionó aquí las negociaciones plurilaterales o los Joint Statement Initiative también siguen trabajando los grupos, se están discutiendo nuevas medidas en facilitación de comercio, en e-commerce, en temas de sustentabilidad, y también datos que no se dicen, pero están ahí. Hay 164 miembros y ninguno de ellos ha pedido salirse del sistema. Y a su vez hay una lista, si no me equivoco, entre 20 y 30 de países que todavía están en fila, que quieren ingresar a la organización. Y eso nos habla, ¿no es cierto?, de un nivel de optimismo y de confianza en el sistema. Simplemente terminar con que aquí tampoco hay que ser muy naif, aquí para solucionar este tema y seguir avanzando se requiere un real involucramiento de Estados Unidos, de la Unión Europea, de China, de India, en nuestro caso obviamente de Brasil, pero si uno tiene que hacer un mea culpa como región, es que tenemos que tener la capacidad de ser entre estas grandes potencias, obviamente que América Latina pueda, ¿no es cierto?, lograr por lo menos tener un par de áreas comunes en las cuales nos sentamos identificados y queramos llevar a la universidad nuestra posición, porque en un mundo más propenso a sufrir crisis climáticas y otro tipo de crisis, la mejor manera de lograr esta resiliencia, obviamente tiene que ser con más comercio y comercio más diversificado, no menos. Y esto requiere estas condiciones previsibles, transparentes, justas y flexibles. Y eso América Latina lo sabe muy bien. El proteccionismo puede ser muy tentador, especialmente en tiempos de incertidumbre, pero en el largo plazo es un callejón sin salida para la inversión, para la innovación, para el dinamismo necesario para dejar atrás este lento crecimiento que venimos experimentando, al menos en el caso nuestro, en los últimos 10 años. Alejandro, yo creo que lo dejo hasta aquí y después podemos seguir conversando.
Muchas gracias, Paulina. Recalco de tus comentarios el silencio ensordecedor de los gobiernos de América Latina ante la necesidad de propiciar una reforma de la OMC. Realmente la falta de coordinación y de diálogo entre los países y pronunciamiento ha sido una gran falla en el sistema. No estamos protegiendo nuestros intereses. Ahora tenemos unos minutos para preguntas, respuestas. Le ofrezco la palabra a quien quiera. Marcelo y después Carlos Primo Braga. Marcelo.
Bueno, en primer lugar, muchas gracias por las presentaciones. Yo aún no leí el libro, pero yo he sido negociador o secretario de Agricultura tanto en la Ronda Uruguay como en el lanzamiento de Doha. La sensación que uno tiene, y en línea con lo que decía Alan, es que si los grandes líderes mundiales, dígase principalmente Estados Unidos y la Unión Europea, y últimamente también puede ser China, no tienen una voluntad política de garantizar el funcionamiento de los mecanismos multilaterales, es muy difícil que esto progrese. Y entonces me parece muy buena idea el tratar de ver cómo podemos buscar second best, por lo menos para encontrar al menos salidas parciales o plurilaterales, o como decía Alan, ver cómo podemos resolver el problema de que Estados Unidos y Europa tampoco quieren aceptar que haya un organismo supranacional que les defina las políticas nacionales, ¿no? Yo quisiera agregar un tema que me gustaría comentar. Yo creo que hay un problema muy serio de gobernanza entre COP y WTO. Y cuando los países toman decisiones unilaterales que tienen que ver con aspectos ambientales, uno no sabe dónde puede ir a discutirlos. Ahí hay un vacío y me parece que es algo que a lo mejor podríamos tratar de construir, porque yo creo que también hay un problema serio de gobernanza en la COP. A lo mejor no tan grave por ahora, pero también uno encuentra los mismos problemas de falta de voluntad de los grandes líderes en cumplir los compromisos que se asumió en la COP, ¿no? Todo el Green Deal y ahora la deforestación es un caso típico de que hacemos acuerdos internacionales y compromisos internacionales a nivel global y después la Unión Europea toma decisiones comerciales violando el espíritu de lo que es la gobernanza global. Entonces, pero para no tomar mucho tiempo, mi pregunta es si no podemos pensar en mecanismos para garantizar de que no haya vacíos en las vinculaciones entre las dos instituciones.
Muchas gracias, Marcelo. Carlos Primo Braga.
Thank you, Alejandro. Alan, very nice seeing you. And I'm at a disadvantage. I have not read your book yet, but I was quite inspired by some of the comments that you made. I have one comment and two questions. I'm particularly interested in your historical evaluation of the pre-historical use of trade because a few years ago, my daughter gave me as a present a toolkit from 23andMe, which is a company that does your genetic evaluation. In my case, there was no big surprise, basically Iberian Peninsula, a little bit of the UK, a little bit of North Africa. But then I discovered that I'm in the 99% superior of people who have influence of Neanderthal genes. According to my wife, this explains lots of things. So I want to read the prehistorical aspect of your book and trade. But the two questions are the following. You mentioned the Trinity experiment, the first nuclear bomb, and the hypothesis that it could ignite a atmosphere fire that would destroy the world. As we know, Hans Bethe, later Nobel Prize of Physics, had made the calculations and had shown that the chances were practically nil that this would happen. So when Enrico Fermi posed bets with his colleagues if the first experiment was going to destroy the world, he knew that chances were very much on his side. My question to you is the following. If Mr. Trump is elected in 2024 and he follows through with the trade war that you suggested in a broad sense, would this mean the end of the multilateral trade system? Or are you sure that this would not happen? So are we about to see a nuclear explosion with the multilateral trade system? And finally, the other question is, I heard for the first time, Patrick mentioned that there is a proposal for an executive body in the governance of the WTO. I would like just for you to explain how this would work. As you probably remember, I replaced Kristalina Georgieva as the executive secretary of the World Bank board. And I'm very curious how this would work without shareholding in the context of an organization like the WTO. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carlos. Anyone else?
Yo.
Perla.
Hello. Hi, everybody. It's nice to see you. Thank you, Alejandro, for the invitation, and congratulations, Professor Alan, for your book. That's a big effort. Well, I was in Geneva till 14 years ago, 2010. Until 6-7 years, I shifted and I became an entrepreneur. So I have my own company. And when I started Boulder, my company, my purpose was to incorporate more women and women entrepreneurs to trade. But then I came to the reality that I first needed to start with the Mexican market. So a little bit building up on your different comments from Patrick, from Paulina. And this has been very refreshing for me because I've been a little bit aside of WTO issues for a while. What's any good insights regarding the role of SMEs, or how can SMEs can benefit still from the world trade system? Because in reality, I mean, SMEs, we are struggling to participate in trade because of many reasons, trade facilitation, but also finance, but also connections. The reality of distance now here in Mexico with all this nearshoring thing, things are starting to gain some momentum after the pandemic. But still, I mean, we are working on socializing more to like SMEs from the state of Mexico, from Guanajuato, what the Pacific Alliance means, what APEC means, and also what you said, Patrick, about the digital commerce. That's a big reality. More or less by 2030, around 50% of commerce will be on digital platforms. And at least in Latin America, we're very far behind in that sense. Just like companies are using, like, I don't know, between 5%, not more than 10%. So these are like the daily basis challenges that, I mean, not the top companies from our countries, but the 80 or 90% of companies face every day. So any thoughts that you have in that regard? And not to add the gender perspective, because that's another different, I mean, a broader discussion that only like 20% of companies participating in trade are led by women. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are running out of time. I'll give the floor to Alan to respond to the questions and comments that have been made. Alan?
Well, first of all, I thank you, those who have commented and those who have asked questions on some very interesting and deep questions that are very important. My bottom line is, I looked up from writing this book and in talking about it once it was out, and realized the world's nations couldn't do this again. Think about it. You know, if you said, let's all bind our tariffs, what would that look like currently? You gathered all the countries together. I mean, Singapore would be okay, but maybe Chile, but to very few. If you say, let's bind our domestic support programs, and you'd find, well, we really can't do that on agriculture. That would be too difficult. So, you know, let's have our standards reviewed in draft. Well, I don't know. That's very complex and burdensome. We don't want to do that. So we got to preserve what we have. I got this really from meeting with ambassadors and deputies, deputy permanent representatives when I was over in Geneva 2 weeks ago. Is you know, we are at the risk of losing what we already have. And you know, the developing countries have said for a long time, give us policy space. Now you have developed countries saying what we really need is policy space. They may not say it quite in those terms, but they'd say, well, national security, we'll be our own judge of that. Thank you very much. We need policy space for national security. CBAM, carbon border adjustment mechanism. Well, we need policy space for doing whatever we want to do at the border with respect to, which may be fine or not, depending on how it all turns out. We need policy space. So policy space turns out to be, let's get rid of the constraints. In fact, localization is very fine. And then industrial policy, we want to really be able to do whatever we want to with industrial policy. So we need policy space. It's easy to consider that we lose what we have. You know, Carlos asked about Trump comes in, and the Trinity experiment, you know, does everything to get destroyed. I think there's a high degree of likelihood. It's not close to zero, almost zero. High degree of likelihood that if Trump did, which he didn't in his first term, but if he did, because he likes tariffs, if he did in a second term put on a tariff, you know, what does the EU do? What does Japan do? What does Canada do? My assumption is they have actually their elected governments. Even when you're not an elected government directly, you're an autocracy, you have domestic political considerations. Well, you said, we'll put on tariffs too. Well, we tried that. We did that 1930, late 1920s, early 30s. Fortunately, there was some folks like Cordell Hull, Franklin Roosevelt, who said, we're going to start unraveling this, tear down those tariff walls. And it took 8 rounds in the GATT to do it. A 50-year period of pulling down the tariff walls. And it is said that, human memory only lasts for 2 generations. If somebody has their house destroyed because they built it in a floodplain and the flood comes along, they lose the house, they won't rebuild there. And their children won't build there. Their grandchildren, they rebuild in the floodplain because actually human memory isn't all that good. We've forgotten. I used to be very boring, maybe still am, with respect to all speeches. Say, talk about Smoot-Hawley, 1930 tariffs, and that's gone. It's you don't talk about tariffs like that again. But Mr. Trump actually does, and is bringing it back. We care about a lot of different things now that we didn't when the WTO was put together, actually when the trading system was put together in the 1940s. Sustainability, food security because of climate change. And I think the WTO has to be a place where trade issues are discussed. And as Hamid Mamdouh would say, deliberation takes place, where we had one good meeting in the pandemic of the General Council, where countries came in on one subject only. What are your problems that you're facing now with respect to the pandemic? And members came in and they weren't talking against each other, and they didn't have position papers that they were just reading from capitals. They were saying, well, we can't get masks. We really don't have personal protective equipment in our hospitals. We don't have ventilators. We don't have ultimately vaccines. There was a real discussion, and that was it. It never transpired that anything further took place of direct value to meeting the next pandemic. Next pandemic comes along, everything will be repeated, with countries seizing shipments in transit and intervening, unless there's a real effort to have a discussion on trade and health. And similarly for climate change, we're about to have the European Union put into effect a border measure that some may take offense at. And it's not something that can be readily solved by litigation. We should be discussing it at the WTO and thinking about, well, what do you do about this? Food security. Is there nothing whatsoever that can be done to avoid the most seriously affected, which are the least developed net food importing countries? Nothing whatsoever that's possible. A bigger world food program, maybe. Maybe there are other things, pledges of supply. Right now, the developing countries are increasingly looking at self-sufficiency. But it's not only the developing countries, Japan and China, which are the wealthy countries, they want greater self-sufficiency. Well, what does that do to the supply of water? What does that do to exhaustion of the land? What does that do to the climate? To have everyone seeking self-sufficiency. So there was a good point made about lack of trust. The only way to have trust is to begin to rebuild it. And that's rebuilding takes a conversation about real issues. And I hope that'll take place. It also takes leadership. And just in response to Patrick, it doesn't have to be a consultative group of 18, but it's also not going to be everything takes place in a room of 164 countries, soon to be 166. So you have different configurations. You try to pull things together. You have groupings coming together to some degree before they get into the room. There were cantons in Switzerland that said, we can't give women the vote because it was up until the 1970s, because the way we vote is we all march into the center of the square in our town, And if you add the women, we couldn't fit. So not possible to give women the vote. I don't think it's impossible to have different institutional arrangements. And the last point I'd make is, what I do know is there was no constitutional convention that put the WTO together. It was a bit of an afterthought. It was not the purpose of the Uruguay round to do it. It just seemed that you couldn't really have services and intellectual property and other things regulated by something that was designed for just trade in goods. So we're not going to, all change will be incremental. It will not be revolutionary, but there should be a real discussion of you can't just run the world on the basis of litigation. You have to have negotiation, and you have to organize yourselves better to get from here to there. And as has been said by those commenting, you need leadership. And I think ultimately it comes back. Right now, it's from the so-called middle grounders. The e-commerce discussions were not a product of the US or the EU or China saying, let's do this. It was a product of Singapore and Japan and Australia. And similarly on SMEs, it was Uruguay that led the effort. Leadership comes from places where people care, people make a difference. And I thank you all for this session, which has been valuable to me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alan. Thank you indeed. This has been a great session. Unfortunately, we don't have more time, but there should be going to be other occasions where we can continue this discussion. To pick up on the last point, leadership is needed, but leadership will not come into effect unless leadership has the support. And we have to provide the support, intellectual and political. And this is a fantastic way to organize that, at least intellectually. So now we have to move and do the politics in order to have our leaders move and, as you said, preserve the system and improve it. I thank you very much once more to you, to Paulina, and to Patrick, and to all the friends who have taken the floor and asked questions and made comments. Thank you, Dorothea, for helping us and for hosting us. And thank you also to the interpreters and to everybody who made this possible. I wish you a very nice day.